In July of this year, the U.S. Department of Energy released what it calls a critical review of impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on the U.S. climate. This report was created at the request of the Energy Secretary Chris Wright. According to the foreword, this report was the result of his request for a diverse team of independent experts to critically review the current state of climate science. And that diverse team of independent experts consisted of Roy Spencer, John Christy, Judith Curry, Stephen Koonin, and Ross McKitrick. Now, I would expect many of you watching this will have heard of some or all of those names before. With the exception of Ross McKitrick, who is an economist, the other four are real climate scientists. They work in universities and they publish in peer-reviewed journals. But their research is not what they are most famous for. They are far more famous for their media work. They publish best-selling books, they have blogs, and they frequently go on TV with a sort of "there's nothing to see here" message about climate change. You've heard 97% of climate scientists agree on climate change. This is that 3%, or at least a sizable fraction of it. Now, being in the minority does not mean we can just disqualify what they say. Science does not work by majority rule. No, we can disqualify what they say by looking at their ridiculous claims and proving them wrong. And that's what we're going to do today. Now, when you make a review or a summary kind of report like this, your conclusions are only as good as the primary sources, the citations that you give. Without primary sources, the whole edifice crumbles. And this report absolutely does cite many, many papers from the peer-reviewed literature. Except unusually for a report such as this, immediately after it was released, many of those scientists whose work was cited came out to say that their work was twisted, misrepresented, or taken out of context. You can see several quotes here. And in the wake of all this, Andrew Dessler was one of these climate scientists who was concerned about the content of the report, and he took up the DOE on its invitation for public comment and posted on social media asking if any scientists would join him in volunteering their time to draft a formal response to the DOE report. Here was the result.
Dozens of climate scientists are rejecting a recent report published by the U.S. Energy Department. At least 85 experts, 85, just released their response.
A few more press clips here, but yeah, 85 scientists agreed to contribute, and here was the result: a 480-page response to the DOE report.
When I heard that there was a report coming out, I didn't know who was working on it, but in my mind, I said, okay, these are probably the people that they got. And of course, it was 4 of the 5 people that I would have predicted. So there are thousands of climate scientists out there, but there's really no other group of people that would have given you this report. If you just go out and find, or just go to the DOE. The DOE has many excellent scientists that work there. And you could have picked any of them and had 5 of them write a report. It would look completely different than this. The only way to get this report is to have these people write it. And that really goes to show you, I think, how much of a sort of minority view this is.
So when it was released, I think it was pretty unique. Obviously they did cite a lot of sources in the report, but a lot of the authors whose work was cited came out to say that their work was taken out of context, twisted. I don't think this is normal, right? When climate assessment reports are released, I don't think there's this kind of backlash of scientists claiming their work was so deeply misrepresented, right? This is unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, it is unusual. And let me just correct you. They did not cite a lot of papers. There are around 300, maybe 350 citations. You can compare that to the IPCC Working Group 1 and Working Group 2. I haven't counted the citations in there, but I estimate there are about 50,000 citations. So 300 versus 50,000, which one of those 2 reports do you think is a more credible assessment of the science of climate change? They're ignoring 99% of the literature. Now, you're also correct that when these reports come out, you normally don't have authors coming out and saying you misrepresented my work. But again, I think that really reflects the goals of the reports. The goal of the IPCC is to actually correctly summarize science. again, I don't know what's in their heads, but it certainly seems to me that that's not the goal of the DOE report. The goal of the DOE report is to create soundbite worthy results that people like DOE officials and EPA officials can then cite and use in their talks and use in their briefs about why we don't need the endangerment finding. The process really determines the product, and the process of this report was so sloppy and so opaque and violated all of the rules that we know. The writing team was hand selected by one person who had a vision of what he wanted the report to be. In addition, it didn't go through any kind of peer review or any kind of credible peer review. Which is another thing that assessments have to do. So, it didn't have any of the procedures in place to make it a credible report. From the outside, my interpretation of what's going on is this is exactly the tobacco strategy. So for those of your viewers old enough to remember, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, tobacco companies made very similar arguments about the science connecting smoking to health impacts. We're not sure. There's too much uncertainty. And they did that not to win the debate, but just to muddy the waters, to make it so that the average person doesn't know. There are people on both sides of the issue. Who knows what the right answer is? I'm just going to tune it out because I have other things I need to worry about. And that's essentially, that's what I think they're trying to do. Although, again, I have no direct knowledge of what's going on in their heads. It certainly seems to me this is what they're trying to do. They're really trying to gin up fake uncertainty as a way to continue fossil fuels social license to operate.
So yes, clearly an unbiased, balanced assessment of the evidence is forthcoming. Now, one of the, I think, most brazen and openly stupid ways that they try to exonerate their client CO2 is right out of the gate here, repeating the old claim, human emissions of CO2 are only about 5% of the annual exchange with the atmosphere. It's an old talking point, and it's based on the fact that nature emits a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere. And it ignores the fact that nature also absorbs a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere. It is a balance. If nature's current contributions of CO2 to the atmosphere had some effect on CO2 concentrations, why have those concentrations been stable for thousands of years? It is because they cancel out. The cycle is in balance. The amount that nature emits and comparing that to what humans emit means nothing. Nature's emissions could be 1,000 times bigger or 1,000 times smaller. Nature cancels out. What goes out comes in. Human emissions, taking carbon from millions of year-old sources and burning it, are 100% what is causing the rise in atmospheric CO2. Now, this claim is bad enough for how nonsensical it is. What I think makes it a lot worse, the authors know this. They understand this perfectly well, and they include this sentence anyway. Literally, the only purpose of including this sentence is to deceive. They're hoping someone will read that 5% figure and walk away thinking that human emissions of CO2 is just pissing in the ocean. It is a shamefully obvious attempt at pure deception. The next chapter is entitled Direct Impacts of CO2 on the Environment, and it kicks off CO2 as a contributor to global greening. And they include this little comparison shot showing a plant under different CO2 concentrations and celebrating how much bigger it is as you increase CO2. This is absolutely a real effect, which is probably why they have two different chapters about it. That's all they have. I don't blame them. I addressed it pretty deeply in my last video, where I show, yes, it is a real effect, but qualifying that it's limited in some cases, or it has additional unintended consequences that are negative on the plants that we depend on. So check that video out. I will go through a few the main points here just because, again, it's so prominently featured throughout this report. I have to address it in this video at least a little bit. So first of all, as I said, it only benefits C3 plants. C4 plants like corn, sorghum, and sugarcane do not see any benefit. They use a different kind of photosynthesis where the extra CO2 in the atmosphere is just not, they don't need it. They're already actually very efficient with the CO2 that they have available to them. Second, weeds are also plants. So if your crop is getting a benefit from the extra CO2, so too are the weeds around it. And that dilutes the effect that you would get on the plant of interest, the crop. It's even worse if your crop is a C4 crop because it doesn't even get any benefit, but the C3 weeds around it absolutely will. There's evidence too that the weeds will be more resistant to herbicides, glyphosate, under enhanced CO2. So they grow stronger and they become harder to control. For example, here's a paper just about one weed. It's a very destructive weed, probably the most destructive weed, called velvet leaf. It is a huge scourge to farmers, estimated at $343 million in damages per year just for corn and soybean crops. And this is just current numbers. Actually, the article is from 1984 when CO2 was 100 parts per million lower. So surely the loss is even greater today now that velvet leaf is stronger. Oh, and by the way, remember that little picture of the plant under different CO2 concentrations, celebrating how much better it grows under higher CO2? Yeah, that was velvet leaf. Oopsie. Next, they claim that many studies confirm a global greening effect by looking at leaf area index with satellite data. Cool. Here are two even more recent studies showing that this trend has already stopped and reversed. But, I'm sure that was an honest admission. They make a big deal about water efficiency, which is another real effect that I talk about in my video. If plants are water stressed, extra CO2 can be a benefit because they don't need to open the little pores called stomata as often to take in more CO2. They can open it less often, which means they also lose less water through the exhale of water vapor, which also happens through those same stomata, which is a benefit if the plant is water stressed. But since most of a plant's water uses and that evaporation through the stomata, the main purpose of it is actually cooling. So while it can be good if a plant is water stressed, it can actually be bad if the plant is heat stressed because it makes it less able to cool itself effectively. But thankfully, CO2 is not also like making the planet warmer or anything, right? They then talk about CO2 boosting agricultural yields, but the trade-off here is that those yields become less nutritious. It's quantity at the expense of quality. You can see some studies here, for example. And now they actually do acknowledge this effect, but they are quick to suggest it can be overcome with genetic engineering, fortification, like how we add iodine to table salt, and suggesting we could all just take multivitamins, which, so simple, right? So ignoring the fact that taking supplements is just not going to happen for a huge fraction of the population, which supplements do you even take? Lalade 2024 showed a very broad variety of nutrients is depleted at enhanced CO2, and supplements have been around for decades. Iron supplements have been around for a very long time. Millions of women in the US are still anemic. So supplements, even though they're available, are certainly not a solution. And remember, this affects everything that you eat. It's not just fruits and vegetables. It's a bag of chips. It's meat. It's everything gets affected by this. All right, so closing out the chapters on plants, they also do not address that enhanced CO2 makes plants more vulnerable to pests like insects and fungal infections, or that climate change itself, CO2-induced climate change, also has a negative impact on plants. And you can see this study from 2024 showing that CO2-induced climate change has a net negative effect. It has a positive effect in some places, but on a whole, on the global scale, according to this 2024 study, the net effect of climate change on plants has shifted now to negative. Again, I'm sure it's an honest admission. They do try to mention climate change as a benefit to plants, citing a single study about French vineyards, which is great news, unless all of the food that you eat does not in fact come from a French vineyard. Next, they touch on ocean acidification, which they claim is a misnomer because pH will not go below 7. Okay, tell that to the doctors who diagnose metabolic acidosis when your blood is below 7.35. But But of course, neutralization sounds better, so this is why they use it. They show that pH has been declining from around 8.11 to 8.05, but then they say it was only 7.4 to 7.5 during the last glaciation about 20,000 years ago. They cited Ray 2018 for that, so I sent an email to Dr. James Ray, and this was his response. In Ray et al. 2018, we show that deep ocean pH rose at the end of the last ice age, but we also show that correspondingly, upper ocean pH went down. The report only describes pH rise at depth, not the pH decrease in the upper ocean, despite both being part of that paper. And he emphasizes too that this kind of CO2 shuffling is much slower than what we're seeing today. You can see another paper here looking at that same deglacial transition. Average rate of 0.002 units per 100 years. That's 50 times slower than the rate that it's decreasing at today. Dr. Ray also had some general comments on the DOE report. This report reads like an undergraduate exercise in misrepresenting climate science, or probably more accurately, a bad AI creation. It uses all the usual tricks of cherry-picking bits of scientific findings with references to try to sound credible, but taking these out of the wider context of the field, which in this instance overwhelmingly shows that rapid CO2 rise poses grave risks to marine life. So thank you, Dr. Ray, for providing that additional context. Next, we're going to get into what I'm going to call the well, but maybe part of the report. And starting with, well, but maybe it's urban heat island. It is a real effect that cities tend to be warmer than surrounding rural areas because of buildings and concrete and dark colors and other things. It's been known since at least the 1800s. What's not real is the claim that this effect has resulted in the instrumental temperature record being significantly and artificially biased to a larger warming trend. It is corrected for in every instrumental temperature data set. The authors claim it is an open question whether these procedures are sufficient, except that this question has been open and answered many times. The simplest way to answer it is just by taking urban stations and rural stations and comparing their trends. For example, here, also here, here, and here. There are also studies comparing windy versus calm nights. Again, finding no evidence of urbanization bias in the temperature record. Now, they, of course, cover this by criticizing whether or not urban versus rural studies are sufficiently able to answer this question. And then they turn around and cite Soon et al. 2023, celebrating that this shows a large urbanization bias, apparently not realizing that Soon 2023 was an urban versus rural comparison study. But, that this one is okay because it showed a result that they like. Science. And how does Soon 2023, which used the same techniques as all of these other papers, how did it come up with such a dramatically different result? Let's call that an open question. By the way, they also fail to address the fact that most of the warming, the greatest warming in the continental US, is over predominantly rural areas. They also neglect that you see the same warming trends at 500 meters altitude as you do at the surface. Cities only exist on the surface. By the way, here's one other report. Objective measures of station quality in urbanization do not have a statistically significant impact on our results over most of the available record. And let's see, who wrote this study? Oh, look at that, Judith Kirby. One of the 5 authors of the DOE report, claiming that urbanization is having a huge effect. I guess she doesn't read her own work. Oh, and speaking of DOE authors not considering their own work, 2 of the authors actually, John Christy and Roy Spencer, are jointly the creators of the University of Alabama Huntsville Satellite Temperature Data Set. They created it. And if you compare their satellite temperature data set to the instrumental one, which is supposedly influenced by all of this urbanization bias, it agrees with the record. The satellite data set agrees with the instrumental record. This is the UAH and the RSS, which is another independent satellite data set. All 3 agree with each other. Are there cities next to satellites, Roy? So our next well, but maybe it's the sun. Just forget about all that. The temperature record is fake and due to urban heat island effect contaminating it. let's say the warming is real, but it's caused by the sun. So they started off claiming that the IPCC 6 report shows a change in total solar irradiance since the Maunder minimum of 0.7 to 2.7 watts per meter squared, which is quite sneaky because this is the actual sun irradiance, not what we receive on Earth. Pretty much anytime anybody talks about radiative forcing, it's in the context of Earth and what it receives. And if you actually look at the IPCC 6 report, you will see it clearly says that the radiative forcing since the Maunder minimum was between negative 0.12 and 0.15. They also complain that the IPCC doesn't sufficiently account for this radiative forcing in their charts, failing to notice, I guess, that the IPCC charts start in 1750, where the Maunder minimum ended in 1715. And of course, this maybe it's the sun question has been researched extensively, and the simple truth is that our giant and ancient star is very stable. Now, they make a very big deal about this Akram gap, which was a satellite that had its launch delayed from 1989 to 1991 because of the Challenger disaster. Apparently, coincidentally, those 2 years make all the difference. Imagine that. Except there are other satellites that measure this, and this question has already been answered. There was a great study this year, and it just clearly shows through all of these data sources that total solar irradiance has not increased throughout the entire satellite era. Pretty neat charts. You can see the 11-year solar cycle in there very well, but there is no increasing trend. In fact, there's actually a slight decreasing trend. And why not? Here are 2 more studies that show the same thing. Dudok 2017 and Montier 2022. Now, the next well, but maybe is them saying, well, okay, forget all that about TSI. What about other solar effects, right? Ultraviolet radiation or particles. And they claim that these other solar effects are not included in climate models, except that they absolutely are included and have been included since 2017. And of course, we also have proxy temperature records. If the warming is explained by some solar cycle that operates over decades, shouldn't we see that if we go back thousands of years? Why is there no similar warming trend to what we see now? Is there something else about the current era that's different from what it was 2,000 years ago? Lastly, this whole "it's the sun" narrative, it ignores direct evidence that we have that the warming is due to an enhanced greenhouse effect. The DOE report even acknowledges this, probably because the evidence is just so overwhelming that the upper atmosphere is cooling. This is only consistent with a greenhouse gas-induced warming. Now, they try to wave it away by saying that this cooling can be explained by ozone depletion. And of course, this has been looked at. The biggest problem with it is ozone only exists in a thin layer of the lower stratosphere. The atmosphere does not stop at the ozone layer. It continues going up. And there are studies looking at the upper stratosphere, ionosphere, mesosphere, mesopause, and thermosphere. There's also a neat study looking at orbital decay of satellites to measure the density of the thermosphere. Any one of these studies is a serious blow to the "it's the sun" idea. There is no mechanism to explain this cooling other than a strengthening greenhouse effect in the troposphere. Not to mention, again, we directly measure solar irradiance. It is not increasing. And we can directly measure the radiative forcing of greenhouse gases at wavelengths only associated with greenhouse gases. I mean, these are 3 independent lines of evidence against the "it's the sun" idea. You really might wonder why they still cling to this. And the reason is, it's just the best they have. Next, the report spends a lot of time looking at the effects of climate change. Now, it focuses mainly on observed effects, what we have seen to date, rather than predicted future effects, and I will do the same. Every paper that I cite, with maybe one exception, is going to be based on observational real-world data. And they start off showing this chart of the frequency of hurricanes and major hurricanes since 1920. You can clearly see, by the way, the red bars are getting taller from 1970 through today, but never mind. Then they move on to landfalling hurricanes, which is a common metric they like to use. Just so they can celebrate that in this very narrowly defined metric, there is no increasing trend. And finally, they show this little table of the strongest landfalling US hurricanes. Point being, you're supposed to look at all of those old dates and ooh and ah about how old they are. So among the obfuscation, they do acknowledge the observed increase in intensity of tropical cyclones, but they try to wave it away and say that the increase in the number of major hurricanes is insignificant, and only because there was a decrease in the total number of hurricanes. I guess trying to say if you have fewer total hurricanes, the proportion of major hurricanes is naturally going to increase because reasons. It's total nonsense. If the increase were simply some statistical quirk, then we wouldn't also be seeing that the intensification rate of hurricanes is increasing. Hurricanes are intensifying more rapidly. As you see in these two studies, intensification rate increase of 3 knots per 24 hours. And there really is a mountain of peer-reviewed papers showing that hurricanes absolutely are getting more intense. We have Elsner 2008, Koonin 2020, Hoyos 2006, Holland 2013, Grinstead 2019. And of course, none of these papers are cited by the DOE. There is also evidence that the length of hurricane seasons is getting longer. You see Keim 2024 here. And hurricanes are also migrating farther away from the tropics. So they're able to hit areas that are less adapted or accustomed to receiving hurricanes, which increases the damage potential. So this is called poleward migration. This is not some statistical quirk. The intensification of hurricanes is a direct result of warmer sea surface temperature. A hurricane is basically a big heat engine, right? It gets its energy, it gets its strength from the warm waters at the ocean surface. If the sea surface temperature increases, the hurricanes can get stronger. They have more energy available to them in order to strengthen. It's that simple, really. Next, they look at wildfires and they show this chart. If you've heard of the YouTube video Climate the Movie, this is literally just the exact same MS Excel chart that they used for that, except they didn't animate it in the report. And as I pointed out in my review of Climate the Movie, the main problem with this chart is that it supposedly cites NIFC data going back to 1926. But if you actually go to the link that they provide as a source for this claim, you will see that it starts in 1983, and they explicitly state that they did not track this data before 1983. So where the hell did the data in this chart come from? Who knows? But I mean, it's not terribly absurd. I mean, the 1930s was a very hot and dry time in the US. It's called the Dust Bowl. They like to act that trending back to the 1930s is just returning back to normal or something, because as everyone knows, the Dust Bowl was such a famously prosperous and comfortable period for this country. Anyway, wildfires. If we look at actual papers, rather than cartoon graphs from YouTube videos, Abatzoglu 2016 found climate change has increased aridity in the continental US and doubled forest fire area since 1984. And 2 studies at a global level, one from Jolly 2015 and Jones 2024, anthropogenic climate change has made wildfires bigger, hotter, and more common. And again, it's not super surprising. As the planet warms, you have an increased vapor deficit. It can lead to drier land and more favorable fire conditions. Next, extreme precipitation, another topic that I have a separate video on. One problem with extreme precipitation, it's hard to have a proxy record. So we don't really have a good understanding in a particular area of what extreme precipitation looked like going back hundreds of years. We really just have modern measurements for extreme precipitation. So they resort to this pretty odd chart showing depth of the Nile River between the years 600 and 1500. The point apparently being to show that it was bad around the year 800 and they recovered. I legitimately have no idea what point they're trying to make here. Proxy records do not show any climate change during this time, so whatever was happening in the Nile was a local event. It wasn't related to any global climate shifts like we are seeing today. And similar to hurricanes, there is a very simple physical explanation for this. As the air gets warmer, it can hold more water. This is literally why you see water condensing out when the temperature falls at night, because the temperature goes down, the air can hold less water vapor. According to Clausius-Clapeyron relation, every increase of 1 degree C of the air, you increase its ability to hold water by 7%. So more water vapor in the air means more clouds, means more rain. They try to claim there isn't observational evidence in extreme precipitation by using this study. You can see little dots representing the stations that they took data from. Kind of look like little orange, green, and blue cherries, don't they? And by the way, in case this sad little chart wasn't bad enough, it's also a self-citation. Oh, and if being a self-citation isn't bad enough, it's not even a citation. McKitrick and Christy 2025 is not a paper. Follow the reference, it just takes you here. They literally just took their station data, uploaded it to Mendeley Data so that they could cite it in the DOE report as if it's an actual paper. I told myself I wasn't going to swear in this video for the algorithm, but what the fuck? Here's what some actually serious papers look like though. You can see they use all of the stations that are available to them, not just whatever the hell that was. And they see clearly, you can see in these charts, statistically significant increasing trends in extreme precipitation over the continental United States. These are Kunkel 2020 on the left and Wright 2019 on the right. We also have Preen 2021, Kunkel 2013, and Groisman 2012. These are all US focused studies. And if we look globally, the trend in extreme precipitation is also quite clear. For example, here, 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 and here. Again, all these studies are based on real world data, not models, not predictions. Extreme precipitation is absolutely getting worse, both at the US level and at the global level. Next, we look at extreme temperatures and a return to the apparent celebration of the United States returning to Dust Bowl-like conditions. The fact that the Dust Bowl happened does not mean that the increase in heat wave days or similar metrics, intensity, duration, it doesn't mean they're not increasing today. Indeed, you can see this trend noted in the peer-reviewed literature, for example, here, here, and here. By the way, I know we're all too young to remember the Dust Bowl, but it kind of sucked. Not a great time to live in the United States. And though a significant event, it was localized to the continental US. If we shift our focus to the other 98.4% of the planet, there is a clear, increasing, undeniable trend in heat wave intensity, duration, spatial extent, and frequency. You can also see increases in heat stress conditions where heat and humidity increase together, measured as wet bulb temperature, as well as increases in heat waves occurring concurrently with drought, which is particularly bad for agriculture. They beat us over the head, as always, with the fact that cold temperatures kill more people than warm temperatures, which is true. Although this chart is based on data from between 1985 and 2012, which if you take the midpoint, the planet was about 0.4 C warmer for that study period, compared to almost 1.4 C warmer today. So the planet is a full degree Celsius warmer than it was when that chart was produced. And according to Lee and Dessler being Andrew Dessler, who we met, 3 degrees is the threshold at which the number of heat deaths is going to increase faster than the decrease in the number of cold deaths. So this is the point at which the warming will have a net negative effect on human mortality in the United States. But again, death is only one way to measure this problem. Increased heat stress also causes heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Flores 2018 shows how heat strain impacts worker productivity. Long-term heat stress and heat exposure can cause chronic conditions like kidney disease and cardiovascular problems. It can also allow for greater spread of disease. Mosquito and tick-borne illnesses, there's already evidence that they're able to spread to new areas. Another health impact of increasing temperature. And higher temperatures can also be damaging to agricultural crops, as we see in these studies here. And livestock, like dairy cows, suffer heat stress and respond negatively as the temperatures get warmer. They do try to address some of the dangers of heat by suggesting that the solution is that energy be affordable. in order to give more people air conditioners. Ignoring the fact that millions of people still work outside, something tells me they have a particular energy source in mind in order to satisfy this need for affordable energy. It's a brilliant solution, right? Burn more coal to run more air conditioners. Like if you need money, just take out a payday loan. Problem solved, right? Next, in the line of effects that the DOE report tries to trivialize, we have sea level rise. Specifically, they try to argue that the acceleration of sea level rise is a projection rather than a reality that we can already measure. So they based their conclusion on what they called an in-aggregate review of US tide gauge station data, and they claimed that by doing this, they saw no acceleration. So the US has 210 long-term water level stations surrounding its coast. We even have satellite measurements that can measure sea level even more precisely than tide gauges. So a true aggregate analysis would of course include all 210 tide gauges as well as this satellite data. And how many stations did the DOE report use for its in-aggregate analysis? 4. The DOE used 4 tide gauge stations out of 210 and no satellite data. That was their aggregate analysis. Now, of course, if you actually take all tide gauge data and the satellite data, first of all, you'll see that the satellite data and the tide gauge data agrees pretty well. And you will also see that in aggregate, you see a clearly accelerating trend for the US coast. And again, if we look at the peer-reviewed literature, it's absolutely consistent with that. There aren't a ton of US specific studies, but the US shares the same oceans as everybody else. So if we look at global studies, we can see, for example, Kazanave and Moreira 2022 shows a clear acceleration from 2.27 millimeters per year in the 90s to 4.68 millimeters per year in the early 2020s. Similar acceleration is found from Dangendorf 2024 and Hamilton 2024. And why not? Here are 5 more. Dangendorf 2019, Frederikse 2020, Narum 2018, Church and White 2011, and Hay 2015. Now, if we preemptively assume that the authors are hunting for some obscure ancient Egyptian records to counter this, we actually do have pretty good proxy records of sea level, such as Walker 2022. This chart is showing sea level rise rate, and it stops in the year 2000, by the way. Here's the rate in 2023. Clearly, no evidence of acceleration. Let's all just keep quiet and look only at the official chart that Daddy Government gave us, in which he conveniently drew a straight line through. So the last major topic that we're going to cover here is Chapter 11 of the DOE report, entitled Climate Change, the Economy, and the Social Cost of Carbon, which I will acknowledge is an area I don't have a lot of experience in, namely economics. So I'm just going to hit the highlights. Now, they make several claims here, and among other authors, cite Richard Toll. I think the only other author that they cite more than him is Roger Pielke Jr., and Dr. Toll authored a blog post explaining what he thought of the DOE report and his inclusion in it. Starting off, he says, I am cited 3 times, incorrectly all 3 times. So the first citation that the DOE makes is Toll 2017, which was rejected from peer review. As Toll notes, he made a mistake when he created this paper and it was not valid. So it was rejected by peer review, but the DOE report used it anyway. The next paper that they cite is Toll 2024, which the DOE interpreted as poor countries are as likely to benefit from CO2 emissions as rich countries. Now, according to Dr. Toll, the authors did not read my paper carefully. Their conclusion that poor countries are likely to benefit is again not backed up with references. Toll 2024, the only reference in that paragraph, concludes the opposite. The social cost of carbon. This is basically the economic cost of all of the sum total impacts of a unit of carbon being released into the atmosphere. Toll says that the DOE authors omit the most influential papers and miss key insights. And in fact, Toll and several other experts in the DOE response report included this pretty striking graph that visually shows just how little of the published literature the DOE actually used for this section. And you can see there is a clear preference for only selecting the lowest estimates. The DOE then makes this other very bold and completely unsourced statement that economists have long been reluctant to endorse attempts to stop climate change or even aggressively reduce greenhouse gas emissions because the costs would not be worth it. Again, they cite no source for this claim. My claim, counterclaim, I guess, is that's bullshit. And I have a source for my claim. This is the 2019 Economist's Statement on Carbon Dividends, signed by 3,649 US economists, including 28 Nobel laureates. And it says, global climate change is a serious problem, and they recommend a carbon tax in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that this be implemented immediately and increased every year. The idea is that this would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they note that this will possibly increase energy costs, so they actually argue that the revenue from this tax should be directly given back to US citizens to offset that burden of increased energy costs. Again, I'm no expert in economics, but that sort of makes sense to me. All right, so we've reached the end. If you watched it until here, thank you. Please, if you thought this was well presented, well researched, consider a like, subscribe, a share would be amazing. If you are a scientist whose work I cited, I hope that I was fair and accurate. If not, please let me know. I will put a correction in the description. In terms of my own closing thoughts on this DOE report, having seen the author list, I pretty much could have guessed what was going to be in it before I opened it. And I expect a lot of people who are familiar with these authors were not super surprised when they read the actual report. These authors chose their little tribe many years ago, and I'm sure they will be in that tribe until they retire. And that's fine. That's just how it is. What's much more disturbing, I think, is that they were asked to write this in the first place. This wasn't a Facebook post or YouTube video. This was an official report from the US Department of Energy. This is the same organization that initiated the Human Genome Project. It is the same organization that manages national laboratories like Fermilab that discovered the top and bottom quarks, or Berkeley Lab that discovered dark energy, or Lawrence Livermore that created the first fusion ignition. It's really sad to see the same organization that was responsible for all of those amazing scientific breakthroughs producing and putting its name on whatever the hell this report was. This report was an insult to that agency. And I hate to imagine where we go from here. So, of course, big thanks to Dr. Dessler for agreeing to sit down with me and give me a few minutes of his time. I'm going to give him the final thoughts to close this video out.
I mean, ultimately, the DOE report is a Rorschach test. People that don't want to believe climate science are going to look at it and go, this is fantastic. This is exactly what I wanted to see. And that's its purpose. That is its purpose. So that, somebody who doesn't want to believe climate change can say, look, this is a report written by 5 scientists. It's important to understand you could create a report like this about literally anything. If you want to say cigarettes don't cause health impacts, I'm sure you can go out and you can find 5 doctors. If you, out of the entire world, find 5 doctors who maybe look credible on paper and have them write a report that says, oh yeah, the evidence connecting cigarettes and smoking is really very weak. They're really trying to gin up fake uncertainty as a way to continue fossil fuels social license to operate.
But you'll see a lot of changes in EPA rules, that were codified that just didn't make sense, that are being challenged by this administration. I think you'll see some rule changes. You'll see legal challenges on those rule changes, and I think you'll see us prevail in those legal challenges.